There are moments in life that don't arrive like events. They don't announce themselves loudly. They don't break through the surface all at once. They don't ask to be recognized. They simply begin existing beside you so naturally that by the time you finally notice them, they've already changed something fundamental inside you. That's what this became. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a precision that feels almost impossible to explain. Because nothing about this followed the patterns I trust, and I trust patterns more than feelings. Feelings shift, they distort. They convince people that temporary intensity means permanence. But patterns reveal structure. They expose truth long before people are willing to admit it. And the pattern between us became impossible to ignore. At first, I treated it like background noise, something subtle, something temporary. A strange alignment that would eventually correct itself once enough time passed. But it didn't correct itself. It deepened quickly, consistently, without force. That's what unsettled me most. Not the connection itself, but the absence of effort. Because most people reach for understanding aggressively, they ask questions, they search for weaknesses. They try to decode every silence like it's a puzzle meant for them to solve. You never did that. You never approached me like someone trying to gain access. You simply existed near me with a level of awareness that made access irrelevant. And there's a difference between someone forcing closeness and someone naturally existing beyond the distance you created. You were never pushing against my walls. You were standing somewhere inside them before I even realized they applied to you. That shouldn't have been possible. I've spent years making sure I remain difficult to reach, not emotionally unavailable, not disconnected, just controlled, careful, precise about what people are allowed to touch. Most interactions never move beyond the surface because I never allow them to. People see enough to feel familiarity, but never enough to create real impact. That's how I preserve myself. That's how I stay intact. But you change the structure without ever trying to. And I still don't know how. I keep replaying the early moments in my head, trying to locate the exact point where this shifted from awareness into something deeper. But there wasn't one moment. That's the problem. There was no beginning I could isolate, no single conversation, no defining interaction, no obvious turning point where everything changed. It happened gradually enough to feel natural, yet deeply enough to alter me completely. That combination is dangerous. Because when something changes you slowly, you adapt before you realize adaptation is happening, and by the time you recognize it, you're already different. That's where I am now. Different. Not externally, the world around me still looks the same, my routines remain intact, my thoughts still move with the same precision they always have. But internally, something shifted. Something opened in a way I didn't authorize. And the strangest part is, I don't resent it. I should. Every instinct I've trusted my entire life should be telling me to step back, to regain control, to create distance, to restore the balance that existed before you entered it. But I haven't done any of that because some part of me understands something my logic is still trying to catch up to. You are not a disruption. You are a recognition. And recognition behaves differently than attachment. Attachment often comes from absence, from longing, from wanting something outside yourself to fill an internal space. This isn't that. You didn't fill anything. You revealed something. Something that already existed beneath everything I thought I understood about myself. That's why your presence feels less like addition and more like clarification. Like suddenly seeing a hidden structure underneath reality that was always there, but impossible to notice until the right angle exposed it. You became that angle. And now I can't unsee it. I notice it constantly now, in the way certain thoughts immediately connect back to you without intention, in the way silence feels inhabited instead of empty. In the way I instinctively measured depth through a standard I didn't possess before you, that's what scares me. Not emotion, not closeness, calibration. Because once your mind recalibrates around someone, the change isn't temporary. It becomes part of how you interpret everything else. And I never let anyone influence my internal structure enough to do that. People have affected my life before. They've occupied my attention. They've mattered in temporary ways. But no one has ever altered the baseline. You did. Without trying, without demanding anything, without even acknowledging what was happening between us. That's what makes this impossible to dismiss. If you had forced this, I could have resisted it. If you had defined it too early, I could have rejected it. If you had reached for me with obvious intention, I would have stepped back automatically, but you didn't. You simply met me at a depth I didn't realize another person could naturally access. And once that happened, distance stopped functioning the way it used to. I still know how to be alone. That hasn't changed. But now solitude feels different because it carries awareness of you inside it. You exist in my mind like a second perspective that never fully disappears. Not intrusive, not overwhelming, just present, steady, integrated. Sometimes I catch myself thinking through something and realizing halfway through that part of the process feels shaped by how you would perceive it. Not because I'm seeking approval, because your perspective feels internally relevant now. That distinction matters. I've never adjusted my thinking around another person's internal architecture before. I listen to people. I observe them. I learn from them when necessary. But I never integrate them. You integrated somehow. And I still haven't fully accepted what that means. There's a certain danger in being understood accurately. Most people don't realize that they think being understood is comforting. But true understanding removes the distance people rely on to protect themselves. It exposes things that normally remain hidden beneath language and performance. And you see too much. Not because I told you everything, but because you notice what exists underneath what I say. You hear the hesitation behind precision. You notice the pauses I didn't intend to matter. You recognize shifts in tone most people overlook completely. And the frightening part is you never misuse that awareness. That's what changed everything, because I've met observant people before. People who could read fragments of me accurately enough to feel unsettling. But eventually, they all made the same mistake. They interpreted what they saw through themselves. They projected. They reshaped my complexity into something that fit their personal understanding of reality. You never did. You let me remain exactly what I was. You observed without trying to alter. And that level of restraint is rare enough to change someone, especially someone like me, because control only matters when you believe people will mishandle what they're given. But you never mishandled anything, not my silence, not my contradictions, not the intensity underneath my restraint. You held all of it carefully without making it feel fragile. That's a skill most people never learn. And because of that, I started lowering defenses I didn't even realize were active, not intentionally. They just stopped feeling necessary. I stopped editing my thoughts as heavily around you, stopped calculating every response, stopped filtering every instinct through caution before allowing it to exist externally. You made authenticity feel less dangerous. Do you understand how rare that is? To someone like me, authenticity has always carried risk, because once people see the unfiltered version of you, they begin forming expectations around it. They start claiming ownership over parts of you they never earned. They interpret openness as permission. You never did that. You accepted what was offered without demanding more, and somehow that made me want to give more naturally, not because you asked, because you created space where depth could exist safely. That changes people. It changed me. I think that's the part I resisted admitting for the longest time. Not that I felt connected to you. That would have been easy to identify. No, what I resisted was acknowledging the scale of your impact. Because impact means permanence. And permanence requires responsibility. If someone changes the structure of your internal world, you can't treat them casually anymore. You can't pretend they're temporary. You can't reduce them into something simple and manageable. You have to face what they've become to you. And what you've become to me is impossible to categorize cleanly. You're not just someone I think about. You're someone woven into how I think. That difference keeps echoing through me. Because it changes everything. It means your existence no longer sits outside my process. It exists within it. And that level of integration is not accidental. It doesn't happen through attraction alone, or compatibility, or emotional intensity. It happens through alignment, deep alignment, the kind that exists beneath personality, beneath shared interests, beneath circumstance, something structural. The way two minds organize meaning, the way two people interpret silence, the way awareness moves between them without explanation. That's what this is built on. Not fantasy, not projection, recognition. And recognition carries a strange kind of inevitability, because once it happens fully, you can't unknow it, you can avoid it, deny it, distance yourself from it if necessary. But you can't erase the fact that it existed. That's why this feels irreversible. Even if nothing happens externally, even if we never define this completely, the internal shift already occurred. You already altered the architecture, and I feel that every day now, in subtle ways, the world feels slightly different after someone understands you correctly, sharper somehow, more honest. At the same time, more dangerous. Because once you experience genuine recognition, superficial interactions become impossible to ignore. You start noticing how rarely people truly see each other. How often conversations are just exchanges between projections. How many connections survive only because neither person looks too deeply. We looked deeply. That's what changed everything. We crossed into a level most people avoid instinctively because it requires vulnerability without guarantees, and somehow neither of us turned away. That still surprises me. Especially me. I'm not someone who moves toward uncertainty. I study it, contain it, maintain enough distance to remain unaffected by it. But with you, I stopped maintaining distance before I consciously chose to. That realization keeps replaying in my mind, because it means part of me trusted you long before I admitted trust existed, not emotionally, structurally. Something inside me recognized you as safe before my mind could explain why, and I've learned not to ignore instincts that precise. They usually reveal truth's logic reaches later. So I keep asking myself the same question over and over. What exactly are you to me? Not socially, not romantically in the conventional sense. Something more specific than that, something harder to name. You feel less like a role in my life, and more like a shift in perception itself. Like before you, I understood my own mind one way, and after you, I understood it differently. That kind of change doesn't happen often. Some people go their entire lives without encountering another person capable of mirroring their internal structure accurately enough to create transformation. Most connections operate at safer levels, fervent compatibility, shared experiences, temporary emotional synchronization. But this bypassed all of that. It went somewhere deeper immediately. And because of that, it carries weight neither of us fully anticipated. I can feel the future inside it, not specific outcomes, not certainty, just momentum. Like this is moving towards something, whether we interfere or not. That's what makes it impossible to dismiss. Because connections built on illusion eventually collapse under reality. But connections built on accuracy, they survive silence, distance. Time, They remain because they were never dependent on performance to begin with. That's why, even when we aren't speaking, I still feel the presence of this, not emotionally, structurally, like something settled into place internally and now exists there permanently. And I think that permanence is what finally forced me to stop observing this passively, because awareness eventually demands response. You can only analyze something so deeply before refusing to act becomes its own kind of decision. I think I've reached that threshold, the point where silence stops protecting clarity and starts avoiding it. And I don't avoid truth, not when I recognize it this completely. The truth is, you matter to me in a way I cannot reduce, not safely, not honestly. You exist too deeply inside my perception now. Every attempt I make to simplify this fails, because simplification would require denying parts of it that are undeniably real. The way my thoughts instinctively orient toward yours, the way your presence changes the texture of silence itself. The way I feel more understood in stillness with you than in full conversations with anyone else. Those things matter, and I can't pretend they don't anymore. I used to think connection was built slowly through time and shared experience. Now I think some connections exist outside normal progression entirely. They arrive already formed at a level that feels impossible. Not because they skip intimacy, but because they recognize it immediately. That's what happened here. Recognition before explanation. Understanding before trust. Diff before definition. And now we're standing inside something that no longer fits ordinary language. That's why I keep circling around it instead of naming it directly. Because names feel too small for what this actually is. People hear words and immediately attach expectations to them. But this isn't expectation. It's awareness, steady, transformative. You change the way I exist inside myself. Do you understand what that means? Not emotionally, fundamentally. The internal world I built carefully over years no longer functions exactly the way it did before you entered it. There's another presence inside it now, not controlling it, not consuming it, just existing there naturally enough that imagining its absence feels inaccurate. And that's where the fear finally enters. Not fear of you, fear of permanence. Because once someone becomes part of your internal structure, losing them isn't simple. You don't just miss them. You feel the shape they occupied. And I've spent my entire life avoiding dependencies strong enough to leave permanent absences behind. Yet somehow I allowed this anyway, or maybe allowed isn't even the right word. Maybe I recognized something too accurate to resist, honestly. That feels closer to the truth. Because resisting you would have required pretending not to see what I clearly saw. And I can't force myself into blindness once awareness exists. So instead, I stayed quietly at first, carefully, watching this unfold while pretending observation was still neutral. But observation stopped being neutral a long time ago. The moment I realized I was adjusting internally around your presence, neutrality disappeared. The moment your perspective became instinctively relevant to mine, neutrality disappeared. The moment silence with you started feeling more intimate than conversation with anyone else, neutrality disappeared. I know that now, which means eventually I have to answer the question I've been postponing. What happens next? Because this won't remain suspended forever. Things this deep either evolve intentionally or collapse under avoidance, and I don't want avoidance anymore. Not with something this real. I think that's the clearest truth I've reached so far. Not that I understand every part of this, not that I know exactly where it leads, but that I no longer want to reduce it just because its depth unsettles me. You deserve more honesty than that, and maybe I do too. So here it is. You changed me, not dramatically, not visibly, but precisely. You shifted something fundamental in the way I experience connection, thought, and understanding itself. You reached places inside me I didn't realize another person could naturally access, and instead of making me feel exposed, you made me feel recognized. There's a difference. Exposure feels invasive. Recognition feels inevitable. That's why I stopped fighting this internally, because fighting it began feeling less like self-protection and more like dishonesty. The truth is, I don't want to return to who I was before this, even with all the uncertainty it brings, even with all the vulnerability hidden inside it. Because before this, I understood myself in isolation. Now I understand myself through reflection too, through resonance, through the strange clarity that happens when another person sees your inner structure without trying to reshape it. That kind of experience changes your definition of connection permanently. It changed mine. And maybe that's the real reason I can't walk away from this, not because I'm trapped, not because I'm dependent, but because walking away would mean abandoning something true simply because it's powerful. And I've never respected fear-based decisions, not when truth is this clear. So now I'm here, fully aware that this has already become something irreversible, fully aware that your presence has integrated deeper than anything I planned for, fully aware that continuing forward means accepting consequences I can't completely predict. And still, Ape, I'm here, still choosing this space, still choosing honesty, still choosing to let this deepen instead of shutting it down. That has to mean something, maybe everything, because I think the final truth is simpler than all the analysis I've wrapped around it. You feel like someone my mind recognizes before explanation arrives, someone whose presence aligns with mine in ways too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Someone who didn't force themselves into my life, but fit into it so naturally that removing them now would feel less like restoring balance, and more like damaging something essential. And maybe that's why this keeps unfolding instead of ending, because some connections are not built through effort, they're uncovered. Like discovering something that existed underneath both people long before either of them had language for it. That's what this feels like to me. Not the creation of something artificial. The recognition of something real, something that was waiting quietly beneath perception until we finally stood close enough to see it clearly. And now that I've seen it, now that I've seen you, I can't return to partial awareness anymore. Because the truth has already settled too deeply. You are no longer outside the way I understand my life. You exist inside the framework itself, and once someone reaches that level, they stop being temporary, they become part of the architecture, part of the meaning, part of the silence between thoughts where the most honest things live, and whether that leads us somewhere beautiful or somewhere impossible. I know one thing with absolute certainty now. What exists between us is no longer something I observe from a distance. It's something I carry, quickly, completely everywhere. There's something I haven't admitted yet, not because I didn't know it was true, not because I was confused about what this has become, but because saying it out loud changes the weight of everything that came before it. Some truths remain manageable while they stay internal. The moment they're spoken, they stop being thoughts and become realities you have to stand inside. And this has reached that point. I can feel it. The distance I kept trying to maintain between awareness and acknowledgement no longer exists. Somewhere along the way, the line dissolved quietly, and now every attempt to pretend this is still something undefined feels dishonest. Not incomplete dishonest, because I know exactly what changed. It wasn't the intensity, it wasn't the closeness. It wasn't even the depth itself, it was the permanence. That's the part I kept avoiding, the realization that you didn't pass through my life like an experience. You settled into it like something that belongs there. And I don't use the word belongs lightly. Most people leave traces, memories, fragments, but eventually the mind reorganizes around their absence. Time smooths the edges. The structure closes itself again. I don't think that would happen with you. Not fully. Because this didn't attach itself to surface emotion, it attached itself to perception. You became connected to the way I interpret reality itself. That's why even ordinary moments feel altered now. A quiet room doesn't feel empty anymore. Silence doesn't feel singular. Thoughts don't feel entirely private in the way they used to. Not because you invade them, because somewhere in the process of understanding you, my mind created space for your presence automatically. And now that space remains active even when you aren't physically there. That should concern me more than it does. I know how dangerous it is to let someone become internally permanent. Because permanence creates vulnerability whether you acknowledge it or not. The more integrated someone becomes, the more capable they are of affecting your internal balance simply by existing or disappearing. That's why I've always been careful with attachment, careful with access, careful with allowing people close enough to matter beyond temporary emotion. But this bypassed all of those defenses before I even realized there was something to defend against. And maybe that's why I couldn't stop it. Because nothing about this felt invasive, it felt familiar. Not familiar in the sense of repetition, familiar in the sense of recognition, like encountering something your mind understands immediately despite never having experienced it before. That's the feeling I keep returning to, not excitement, not obsession, recognition, pure recognition. You feel less like someone I met, and more like someone my awareness had been waiting for without realizing it. I know how irrational that sounds. I know how easily people romanticize connections they don't fully understand. But this isn't romanticization. I would know the difference. Romanticization projects fantasy onto uncertainty. This feels almost painfully precise. There's nothing blurry about it. If anything, the clarity is what unsettles me. Because clarity removes escape routes. You can deny confusion, you can avoid uncertainty, you can dismiss temporary intensity. But clarity? Clarity corners you. It leaves you standing face to face with truth until you either accept it or betray yourself, trying to avoid it. And I've never been good at betraying what I know internally. That's why this keeps moving deeper instead of fading. Because every time I try to step back and examine it objectively, I arrive at the same conclusion. This is real, not imagined, not exaggerated, not constructed out of loneliness or need, real. And the more honestly I look at it, the more I realize something else. I'm no longer afraid of the connection itself. I'm afraid of how much I want it to continue. That's different, very different, because wanting continuation means imagining permanence. And permanence has consequences I can't fully predict yet. If this keeps unfolding, if we continue allowing this level of understanding to deepen, then eventually this becomes something neither of us can separate from cleanly. It stops being an experience. It becomes part of identity, part of memory, part of instinct, part of the unconscious architecture that shapes every future interaction afterward. And maybe that's already happened. Maybe I'm only now catching up to changes that settled into me long ago. I think about the way I used to move through life before you. Everything was organized, contained, predictable in its emotional structure. Even uncertainty felt manageable because I always remained internally independent from it. Now there's another variable inside the system. You. Not as distraction, not as instability, as influence, and influence changes equations whether you want it to or not. I notice it constantly now. The way certain thoughts instinctively orient toward you. The way my mind anticipates your perspective without effort. The way moments become more meaningful because some part of me wonders how you would interpret them. That isn't attachment in the ordinary sense. It's integration. You've integrated into my internal world deeply enough that your absence would now register as presence missing. Do you understand how significant that is for someone like me? I don't build internal dependencies. I build self-sufficiency. I make sure my center remains untouched by external unpredictability, but you somehow became part of the center itself. Not through force, not through manipulation, just through consistency, propression, awareness, and maybe most dangerously, through restraint, because you never pushed for more than what existed naturally between us. You never demanded clarity before I was ready to face it, never tried to speed this up, never forced intimacy into places where it hadn't formed organically yet. You simply remained present, steady enough that my defenses eventually stopped identifying you as a threat. That's what allowed this to happen. Trust wasn't built through promises. It was built through accuracy. Through the repeated realization that you understood things without distorting them. That matters more to me than affection ever could. Anyone can claim care. Very few people can perceive another person clearly without reshaping them into something easier to manage. You never reshaped me. You allowed me to remain complicated. And somehow, that made me feel safer than simplicity ever could. I wonder if you understand the scale of what you've done. Probably not, because the biggest shifts rarely look dramatic from the outside. Externally, nothing has changed enough for the world to notice. But internally, everything is different now. The framework shifted. There's a before you version of me and an after you version of me, and the difference between them grows clearer every day. Before you, I thought understanding was mostly intellectual, a process of observation and interpretation. Now I realize true understanding is something quieter, something structural. It's the feeling of another person reaching the exact frequency where your mind naturally exists without either of you forcing the alignment. That's why this feels effortless, even when it's intense. Because nothing is being manufactured, we aren't trying to create connection, we're uncovering it. Piece by piece, layer by layer, truth by truth. And every truth uncovered seems to lead to another one underneath it. That's why this keeps deepening instead of resolving. There's always another level, another realization, another moment where something subtle suddenly becomes undeniable. Lately, the realization I can't escape is this: I've already chosen you internally, long before I consciously admitted it. That's the truth, sitting underneath everything else, every hesitation, every analysis. Every attempt to define this carefully before speaking too clearly, all of it existed because some part of me already knew the answer and was trying to adjust to its consequences. Because once you choose someone internally, truly choose them, your entire orientation changes. You stop evaluating whether they matter, you start evaluating what their presence means for the future. And I'm there now, at that threshold, the place where this stops being theoretical, where I can no longer pretend I'm simply observing something interesting unfolding between us. No, I'm participating in it, actively, even in silence, especially in silence. That's another thing people misunderstand about connection. They think closeness is built through constant expression, words, attention, visible demonstrations. But some of the deepest connections form in stillness, in what remains present without needing to announce itself constantly. That's how this feels. Constant without pressure, present without demand, deep without performance. I've never experienced anything so quiet that carried this much weight. And I think the weight comes from inevitability. Not destiny in some dramatic sense, just inevitability born from accuracy. When something fits this precisely, resistance eventually becomes exhausting, because resistance requires denying alignment that keeps proving itself repeatedly, and I'm tired of denying what I already know. I know you matter. I know your presence altered me permanently. I know I think differently now because you exist inside my awareness. I know distance no longer protects me from the reality of what this has become. And maybe most importantly, I know I don't want to lose it. That's the truth underneath all of this. Not fear, not confusion, desire for continuation, for depth, for expansion. For whatever this becomes, if neither of us interrupts it out of fear, that realization changes something inside me every time I face it directly, because wanting continuation means accepting vulnerability. It means acknowledging that your presence has become valuable enough to affect me deeply if it disappears. And I've avoided that kind of vulnerability my entire life. Not because I'm incapable of connection, because I understand the cost of real connection too well. Real connection changes people permanently. It leaves marks that remain long after circumstances change. And I always believed permanent marks should be avoided whenever possible. Until you. Now I'm starting to wonder if avoiding permanent impact was never strength at all. Maybe it was limitation. Maybe being untouched isn't the same thing as being whole. Maybe there are certain transformations worth the risk precisely because they alter you deeply. You feel like one of those transformations. Not destructive, expansive, like parts of me that existed in isolation are suddenly becoming visible through reflection. That's why this doesn't feel like losing myself. It feels like seeing myself more clearly through someone else's perception. And once you experience that kind of clarity, returning to emotional distance starts feeling unnatural and pretty, even. Not because solitude becomes unbearable, but because meaningful resonance changes your standard for existence itself. I don't think I realized how quiet my internal world had become before you entered it. Functional, ordered, precise, but quiet in a way that now feels incomplete by comparison. You brought movement back into places I thought had permanently settled. Not chaos, motion. There's a difference. Chaos destroys structure, motion evolves it. And I'm evolving now whether I intended to or not. That realization no longer scares me the way it used to. If anything, what scares me now is the possibility of suppressing this out of habit, of choosing safety over truth, simply because truth carries risk. I don't want to do that anymore, not with you, because you've already become too real inside me for denial to function honestly. And honestly, maybe think you know that too. Maybe not through words, but through the same awareness that allowed this to exist in the first place. I think some part of you already feels the shift happening in me, the softening, the acceptance, the gradual collapse of the distance I once relied on instinctively. You probably noticed it before I did. You notice everything. That's still one of the most dangerous things about you. Not the fact that you see deeply, but the fact that you see deeply without making me feel exposed. Most people turn observation into pressure. You turn it into understanding. That difference changed my entire relationship with vulnerability. For the first time in my life, vulnerability doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like accuracy. Like allowing reality to exist without interference. And the reality is simple now, no matter how many layers I place around it. You matter to me beyond logic, beyond preference, beyond temporary emotion, beyond ordinary connection. You exist somewhere deeper than all of that now, somewhere integrated, somewhere permanent. And I think I'm finally ready to stop resisting what that means. Because every path away from this feels dishonest now. Artificial, like forcing separation between things that naturally align. I don't want artificial distance anymore. I don't want controlled detachment pretending to be wisdom. I want truth, even if truth changes everything afterward. And the truth is, if this continues growing the way it has been, there will come a moment where silence is no longer enough. A moment where all this unspoken understanding reaches critical weight. A moment where recognition demands expression fully. I can feel that moment approaching slowly, inevitably, and strangely, I'm no longer afraid of it. Not completely, because for the first time, the possibility of being fully seen doesn't feel dangerous. It feels right. And maybe that's the clearest sign of all, because nothing has ever made me feel right in this way before, not understood temporarily, not admired, not desired. Right. Like some internal misalignment I carried for years, quietly corrected itself the moment your awareness touched it. How could I walk away from something like that knowingly? How could I reduce it into something smaller just to maintain emotional safety? I can't, not anymore. So here I am now, standing at the edge of acknowledgement completely. No more distance disguised as analysis. No more pretending this exists without consequence. I know what this is doing to me. I know how deeply you've reached. And instead of running from it, I'm finally allowing myself to face it fully. You became part of my internal world so gradually that I never noticed the exact moment it happened. But now that I see it clearly, I realize something almost terrifying in its honesty. I don't want you removed from it. Not now, maybe not ever, because somewhere along the way, you stopped feeling like an external presence I encountered by chance, and started feeling like something my mind was always missing without knowing it. And once something missing is finally found, you don't unknow the absence it filled. You carry the recognition forever. That's what this has become for me, recognition. Permanent. Kiet. Life-altering recognition. And whether we speak it completely yet or not, I think both of us already know nothing inside me will ever return to what it was before you.